everyone. Welcome to the Stage Door Show. I'm Dave Hondel. Tonight, my guest I have the honor of meeting recently on a video shoot set that I was on. Wasn't only impressed with this company's work on the shoot, but absolutely loved listening to the stories of him growing up with his father, who was my all-time favorite sports broadcaster. I'm looking forward to this conversation, so please welcome Mr. Kyle Summerall to the show. Thank you, Kyle, for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Dave, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You know, Kyle talked about your company, and I understand you just celebrated recently 25 years with the company Spectrum out in Jacksonville that you partner with Nick Furst, Stuart Neal, and now Andrew. I believe Nick's son is with you as well. So talk about your company a little bit, because you guys just work so well together, and your partnership was amazing.
Well, thank you. We actually met at another production company, and you know, as you know, being in the business, it's long hours, it's weekends, it's nights, and
all of the above. Yeah,
we were working all the time, and after a while, we got tired of making the bosses airplane payments, so we hung out our own shingle and started our business, and you know, a quarter of a century later, here we are.
You know, and working with you, you just everything you guys did was so professional. And just listening to you interview some of the folks on the set, you know, I mentioned that your father was my favorite broadcaster, and Pat Summerall was your father. And you know, talk about that. Was that part of your interest in doing interviews and getting in the business of production? Was growing up around it all the time? Was that kind of your inspiration?
Well, I don't really think so. If it was, I would have sort of followed in his footsteps and done what Joe Buck has done. His father was the late, great Jack Buck. But, you know, that life there's a price to be paid for that. You're never home. You really don't have a family life. It's not all it's cracked up to be. And, you know, I met my wife when I was very young. We met in high school, and I just didn't want to go that route. So, yeah, I was actually an English major in college, did some freelance writing for the PGA Tour, for the ATP Tour tennis, and just gradually developed an interest in production. And I've always had an interest in technology and computers and that sort of thing. So when I came along, that was sort of the cusp of computers revolutionizing the production industry. So I guess I just got in at the right time, and, you know, just still love it today.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned you're a writer, and, you know, I think doing interviews and writing, you know, you're telling stories essentially. So your appetite for the story, is that something that you know, when you sit down with somebody, is that something that I know I do. I like learning about people and learning about how they got into what they're doing and just the story of their life. Is that something that also interests you when you do stuff like, you know, interviews like this?
You know, Dave, I love people. I love talking to people. I love finding out about them. You know, might be a famous person, might be somebody you'd never heard of, but everybody's got a story. And I find most people's stories very interesting. My dad was a great interviewer, and he kind of patterned himself in that regard after Barbara Walters. I don't know if you're old enough to remember her, but
absolutely,
you know, and what he taught me was to listen to people. Don't just come with a list of prepared questions and, you know, determined to get them all in.
Right.
Listen to people and react to what they're saying, and it makes for a more interesting conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of times I'll have my notes and my bullet points, but as people talk, it brings up another question. And sometimes I don't even look at my bullet points, because it's actually more interesting to react to what they're saying. So I appreciate you saying that, because as you know, somebody who interviews people, I do the same thing. You know, a lot of times I like to be prepared, but sometimes not being prepared, you know, just going with the flow sometimes is even better. You know, but also you mentioned your father was an interviewer, and, you know, looking back and when I was growing up, I mean, you know, Tom Brookshire was his first, I believe it was his first partner in the sports broadcasting world prior to John Madden. But, you know, they just seemed to have great chemistry on the screen, and, you know, something that you don't necessarily see all the time. You know, maybe they might be great on screen, but then, you know, off screen, they're not, you know, they're not very compatible. But it seemed like your dad and Tom Brookshire were very compatible, you know, on and off screen for at least the first part of their careers.
Well, I think they certainly were. Some might say too much because those were different days, and they were pretty. They were like rock stars in a sense.
Yeah.
There were no cell phone cameras, and a lot of their exploits occurred after the field, carousing at night and having a
Yeah.
good time. Dad described Mr. Brookshire as the closest thing to a brother that he'd ever had, and so they were very, very close. But they had a synergy on the air as well, and I think part of that is they didn't, and you see it a lot today with people trying to force themselves. They didn't have to force anything. They were the same way off the air as they were on the air, and I think that's true of Coach Madden as well. What you saw in the air is what you got off the air.
One of the things that when I was preparing for this, I remember growing up, John Madden having a fear of flying, and so he would drive his bus from game to game and week to week. And when you were growing up in that industry, around your dad, did you ever? What was that like? I guess from somebody who was kind of a fly on the wall, did that ever create any kind of issues where he wasn't getting to the games the same time maybe as your dad did, or was that ever an issue of him showing up on the bus? That's one thing I wanted to ask you to see if there was ever an issue of the timing of things, because I know they have to prepare for games, and was it ever an issue because there wasn't cell phones back then?
Yeah, I don't think John was ever late to a game. He left his whole life was pretty much football and
Yeah.
family. So, but there were a few times when he couldn't go, when they had a pregame, preseason games overseas, for instance. Dad did one in Australia with Matt Millen, I believe, another one in Dublin, Ireland, and so obviously he wasn't going to take a sailing ship. So
Yeah.
others did that gig, but I don't think it ever really caused an issue. It was kind of neat because John parlayed that into the whole Madden Cruiser thing, and the bus and
Yeah.
the whole traveling road show that became a big deal back in those days. So if anything, it was a benefit, I think.
Now, when you and your siblings were growing up, I mean, was there somebody that was more interested in sports? Because I understand you wanted to be a professional athlete at one point. So were you more drawn to, I guess, the football life, or was your siblings also as interested as you were in the sport?
I think all three of us, I have a brother and a sister. I think all three of us just love sports, but that's all we did as a family.
Yeah.
I can remember we were living just outside New York City, and we used to come down to Florida and vacation. That's sort of how we discovered this place. And we vacationed at a place called Amelia Island, and we would be up at about 7:30 in the morning. We'd be hitting range balls by 8 o'clock, 8:15 tea time, and it didn't matter what the weather was. It could be 110 degrees.
Yeah.
18 holes of golf, shower, get a bite to eat, family tennis, change clothes, hit the beach, throw the ball around, you know, um, go home, shower, eat, maybe play board games, and then just repeat the process the whole vacation. I remember coming back to school one time, and I had my head on my desk, and my teacher said, "Kyle, what on earth is wrong with you?" I said, "I've been on vacation."
So vacation was work almost. When you were growing up, also, did you realize, I guess, the enormity of what was going on in your lives? I mean, with your dad being on national TV, and there was only a few networks at that time. So I mean, everybody that was on those networks, they were, like you said, rock stars, superstars. Because there wasn't any other entertainment, so people were drawn to who was on TV. And your dad was on every weekend. So did you understand, I guess, the celebrity of it when you were growing up?
I don't think until I got to be a teenager I really grasped it, because he's just dad. He's just around the house, and
Yeah.
you just don't think that way when you're a little kid. I think I was maybe in sixth grade when a helicopter landed in our front yard and took him to a Giants game, and all the neighbors were out, and my friends from the neighborhood were, "What's going on?" And I guess that's the time it first dawned on me that, hey, maybe dad's a big deal.
When I was listening to a player when I was growing up, one of the Purple People Eaters, Carl Eller, they were talking about back in those days when, even before that, when your dad was playing, it just, people had to have other jobs. They weren't making the kind of money that they're making today. So the life was a lot different as a player than than it is today with the kind of money people are making. So you almost had to have a kind of a life of kind of a working life, where you had football on the weekends and practice, but you also had to have another job. So as you went through, and then you saw your dad broadcasting, and all these people, started making these big salaries. I mean, so you were part of that evolution and you saw it, but did you realize back then that it was you almost had to have two jobs back then for a player?
I didn't really realize it at the time, but I learned later on. As you get older, you begin to understand things a little bit more. And my dad signed, I think his starting salary with the Chicago or Detroit Lions was the first team he signed with as a rookie, was something like $5,200. I
wow.
mean, which again, that was
it's all relative, right?
Money in those days, but not a lot. And like you said, everybody had second jobs, and Dad taught school and this, and when he was not playing football, and worked on farms in his hometown of Lake City. And that was just standard procedure. Nobody was able to just play football and earn a living doing that. They did it because they loved it. But and incidentally, everybody thinks of him as a kicker, but he was drafted as an end because you didn't have kicking specialists in those days. You couldn't justify your salary just by kicking the football. You had to be able to do something else.
So some guys did defense and offense, both. I mean, back then, and it was pretty. I mean, it's like I said, it's all relative. I mean, back then it was normal. So now you would never see that. But when you were on the road, let's say with your dad, and getting to know some of the folks that we'd all known, like Irv Cross and so forth, and some of the guys. Is there a memorable person that you remember growing up as a child, that somebody who was really nice to you, and like on the set or at a game?
Well, people that you've probably heard of and those that you haven't. Dad's boss at CBS for a lot of years was a guy named Bill McPhail, and he was a good friend of the family, but he's also just a really good guy, and he was an innovator. He's the guy that actually brought instant replay to the NFL. He didn't invent it, but I guess whoever did brought it to NBC first, and they said, well, this will never work. It's a live game. You can't stop it. And McPhail had the foresight to understand that, hey, you're onto something here. But, my parents would have parties. And when you're a little kid, a lot of times adults don't pay attention to you. You're just part of the scenery, right? Because you're not important. But McPhail would always get down and, look at me in the eye, even though I was a little kid. How you doing? And how you doing in school? I'm doing great. No, you're not. Don't BS me. He just was a great guy. But beyond that, I mean, Mr. Brookshire was an idol of mine, and of course, Coach Madden. But you mentioned Irv Cross. That whole crew was fantastic, and just being around them, and not just the talent, all the people behind the scenes, all the technicians, all the camera people, they were just the best of the best. And that's why when Fox wrested football away from CBS, they pretty much brought everybody they could from CBS because they knew they were the best.
Yeah, for sure. And they were loved watching, CBS and then Fox when it became, the football channel or network. But, one of the things that you mentioned to me when we had a conversation before was, I believe your dad was the first one to ever say instant replay. Is that correct?
He actually coined the term instant replay. And
that's amazing.
I asked him, it's one of those things. It's a footnote, but you can look it up. They didn't really have a word for it. And so he said it just came to him and it sounded right. So he said it on the air, and obviously it stuck.
And we talked about this, a few weeks ago when we met, but you had, I asked you the question about, this new movie, this Madden movie that Nicolas Cage is in, because it's, about the life of John Madden. Some of these shows or these movies are kind of done unofficially. I mean, they're done without maybe proper, authority of the people that maybe were part of this, and just your thoughts on those types of movies. And is this movie something that you're looking forward to watching, or is this something that you feel that maybe should have been a little more I guess, run past, the family, I guess, of those playing the characters.
I spoke to my brother a couple of months ago about it because we hadn't heard anything about it. And I'd asked if anybody had contacted him. He said no. But, that's not their obligation. They're filmmakers. And, they're going to, of course, I'll watch it and
Sure.
I'll probably enjoy it. And, I hope they portray my dad the way he ought to be. But, I learned a long time ago that because of my father's style, because he was so understated, he was never concerned about being the star.
Right.
He let Coach Madden do that, and he kind of supported him in a way that let Madden be Madden. And I'm not sure people realize how important he was to that. I think maybe they did later when Dad retired and Coach Madden went on to work with other people, and the synergy just wasn't there. And football fans know this. So real football fans understand, that Dad was every bit of the player that Coach was in the broadcast booth. But, John was the flamboyant one, and he was the star of the show. So I expect that's what's going to be in the movie as well. And that's okay. That was okay with Dad, too. He was a very humble man. He didn't need all that. He was happy. He just felt grateful to be where he was. And he felt like his life was just one big blessing.
And I also saw in a football life that he actually started his career not necessarily as a sports broadcaster, but he did weather and doing traffic and doing just broadcasting all kinds of things, not just sports. So did he enjoy that? It seemed like he did. It seemed like he really got into. But his voice was such a deep, kind of a rich voice that that's one of the things I fell in love with too, is a voice. So was that kind of how he got noticed by the network because of his voice?
I think in part how it happened, he was actually 6 days a week. I mean, spinning the records, the whole thing, and doing sports for WCBS radio in New York. And he would get up at 4 a.m. and do that.
Wow.
For not a lot of money. And I think that just people think that it's just all glamour and glitz, but there's dues to be paid in anything you do in life. And he certainly paid his. He was a roommate with Charlie Connerly, who was the quarterback of the Giants back in those days. Charlie was retiring, looking for something else to get into after football, but he'd been out all night, and I guess he missed his audition. So they called the apartment, and my father answered. And the guy said, "Well, do you want to come here and audition?" And Dad said, "Well, I guess so," because he was thinking about retiring too. Wow. So he went down, and that's how he got the job. As far as the voice goes, if you look at those, listen to the early interviews he did and the radio shows, he worked on that voice. He worked on it for many years and actually deepened it and did that for effect, I think.
Sure.
But then it became his voice, and that's how he was around the house as well. So
it's like his signature,
It was a signature. And I think he had a quality where it was kind of a soothing thing where you feel like it didn't matter if you were a six-figure executive or a mechanic at the local garage. You felt like you knew him. You felt like you could relate to him. You felt like he's a guy you want to hang out with, have a beer, cup of coffee, whatever.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I want to get into your business spectrum a little bit because I know we talked a little bit about when we started recording, but one of the things that, for your process, I want to talk about a little bit because for the listeners out there who are in production or directors or producers and so forth, I want you to talk about, because one of the things that really impressed me watching you all work was the preparation that went into everything you did, not just the interviews, but, just, setting up the lights, the lights, not only were they perfectly set, but even the background was lit, in a certain way so that, these are things that I think a lot of production houses don't really think about. They think about the subject, but you think about not only that, but the background and what the viewers going to actually see, and it's pleasing to the eye, and the sound was just spot on. So talk about the preparation and the importance of preparing for each and every shoot. And, sometimes it may take a little bit longer to do something, but in the end result is going to be that much better. So talk about your preparation.
Well, I'm fortunate enough to be working with guys that are professionals that take their craft seriously. And it doesn't matter what the shoot is or what the budget is. We're going to do, my former partner, Stu Neal, who unfortunately you mentioned he's passed away some years ago, but he made a statement one time. He was an editor. He said, no project is ever finished. It's simply abandoned. And that's because you tweak it just as long as you have. You've got something to do on next Wednesday. So it's Tuesday night when you finish this other thing because there's always something you can improve. The guys I work with are consummate professionals. And so that makes me want to do better. I think it does an interview subject an injustice if I go in there and I haven't prepared to the best of my ability, then I'm wasting their time. So
right.
I want to do that. I do it as a writer. When I write something, it might just be one paragraph, but it took me 2 hours to write because I wrote it and I changed a few things. I ate lunch and thought about something else and changed it again. So, hard work and preparation, there's no substitute for that in any business you're in, particularly this one.
Yeah. And, just watching you all, and I, from doing music videos, I remember what it's like when you don't have, I didn't have a lot of budget for what I was doing. So I was hauling, my tripods around and hauling my lights around and setting up the lights and getting the extras and, doing all these things. But, I can appreciate every position, when I produce things, I've obviously, I'm looking to hire all those positions to do those things for me. But at the same time, I also appreciate what all those folks do. And just, I think it makes the project that much more enjoyable, and it makes it that much, more gratifying when it comes out on screen, knowing what the work, that kind of went into it, what it entailed. So what kind of advice would you have for somebody that's kind of just getting started in the production field? You've been in it for so many years, but what kind of advice would you have for somebody that's maybe looking to start a production company or looking to make, short films or, it doesn't even matter what the project is, just doing something creative?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, if you don't love it, and I'm sure you do, Dave, I mean, it's obvious that you do.
Yeah.
If you don't love it, don't get in this business because it is hard work. It is long hours. It is a lot of time and effort and, maybe away from your family sometimes too. So you have to love what you're doing. And there's a lot of different areas of production that you can go into. So if you don't love being an editor, maybe you love being a graphic artist, maybe you love to shoot, you're behind the camera. Find something you love, and it's a cliche, but then you'll never work another day in your life if you find that. And then also, don't be afraid to take some creative chances sometimes. It's not always, you can't produce something artistically worthy from a fact sheet. It has to come from somewhere else. It's art after all. And so take chances, do a different angle, experiment with different things, lighting effects and that sort of thing. And then, as I say, don't ever give up. Don't take no for an answer. I was up at NFL Film some years ago, and the guy that's running the film vault, or at least was at that time, was a guy that wasn't in the production business, but he loved football, wanted to be around football. And he came to NFL Films. Steve Sable was running it at the time.
Right.
And he said, look, I've got to work here. And Sable said, well, you have no experience in production, get out of here. He came by the next week. He said, look, just give me a chance. I'll mop the floors. I'll sweep, just, and he ended up working his way up, and he was in charge of that priceless inventory that they have of all these NFL games that took place over the years. He was in charge of all of that. And he started by camping out on their doorstep and refusing to give up.
Yeah, that's a great story. I remember when I was younger, I was such a huge football fan and Vikings fan that I used to hang out at, this store that was run by two of the Vikings running backs, Darren Nelson and Ted Brown. And I finally ran into Darren Nelson one day and I said, hey, I want to work for your company, and they had just started this venture. So, I don't even know that they really 100% knew what they were doing. But he said, yeah, come on, come on aboard. You work part-time, whatever, and worked myself up to being the manager of their business and running their charity basketball team. And it sounded like that guy that was mopping the floors. I mean, he obviously came across as having that passion. Also I see behind you there, the beautiful skyline of Jacksonville. So how long have you been in Jacksonville, and is that a great place to have your business? Because it seems to be.
Well, again, I mentioned we lived in New Jersey, just outside of New York City, until I was 15. Both of my parents are from small town Florida, a little town called Lake City, which is about 15 miles south of the Georgia border in the middle of nowhere. But that's where they're from, and they met early on as well. And then when my dad was in a position to get out of New York, that's what he wanted to do. I don't think they ever really fit in the city. I mean, they could move in any circle,
Sure.
but they were more comfortable at home. So when I was 15 and just a freshman in high school, they decided to move back to their little hometown of Lake City, which was even smaller then than it is now. So it was quite a bit of culture shock for my brother, my sister, and myself being the youngest, going into high school. But, you learn to adapt, and we have relatives there that are just great people. And I really think that it's given me and my brother and sister perspective on people. And you realize that people are people, no matter where they are. There's great people everywhere. So, and it wasn't too long after that my parents bought a place here in Jacksonville, a condo on the beach, and we started coming to Jacksonville. Just fell in love with it. We actually live in Ponte Vedra, which is a beach town just outside of Jacksonville, and we just love it. It's great. We got beautiful beaches, and we got the city's big enough to have some culture and concerts and good restaurants and that sort of thing. So I really don't miss New York anymore.
It's funny. I lived in New York for 10 years, and one of my favorite places, and I still call Orlando home because where my kids, their roots are. They went to middle school, high school, and my son still lives in Orlando. So that's one of the I miss Florida in a lot of respects. But again, going from New York to Florida and back again to to the East Coast. Now I'm in the Philadelphia area, but I can appreciate the I guess the pace of life in Florida. So I do miss Florida in a lot of respects.
Well, 70 degrees in December doesn't suck either.
You can't beat it. This is the time of year where it's like, that's why you live in Florida. What kind of legacy do you want to leave, behind Kyle when it's all said and done? What kind of story do you want to leave behind?
Well, I want to be, I want my family to be proud of me, my children, my grandchildren. I want them to look at me and say, he worked hard. He did the right thing. He did right by his family. Those are the things that are important in life. And that's what was important to my father as well. And I think later on in his life, I was out in Dallas visiting him one time, and he was almost apologetic that he was gone so much, that we didn't have more time together, even though we had a lot, and I did travel with him. Let's face it, the requirements of the job he had took him away from home a lot. And I think that bothered him, and he wished he could change it. And I found that interesting, that with all that he achieved monetarily and fame and all the things that the world gets, that's what bothered him, not just me, but the family in general, not being able to spend as much time with us. So those are the things that are important to me, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I love that answer, and that's I'm into more than anything right now is legacy, because of people like your father and people like some of the folks that I used to watch growing up, and they don't necessarily have to be celebrities. Just even my grandfather, who's in World War II, and like who's protecting the legacy of these folks, and are they going to be remembered 30, 40 years down the road? Are we going to be remembered when we're gone? And so legacy is heavy on my mind right now, and I think mostly because of the generation that's the younger generation. They don't even know what Love Boat is. The Love Boat, not that they should or that they need to.
Oh, that's probably a good thing.
You know what I mean? Yeah, but
I do, and
yeah, that's where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah, and I get that, and I think part of that too is because I've thought about that, is that the legacy is what the people that follow you take from you, right? The things that they learn from you and they pass on to their children and grandchildren and, coworkers and everyone else. And in my own case, and I think it's true for most people, you look at the good, you take that, and if something doesn't fit, you get rid of that and,
Yeah.
improve so that every generation gets a little bit better as people.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of my favorite shows is Henry Louis Gates, Finding Your Roots. And, I think that's probably where this whole legacy thing started, with people finding, who their great, 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 great grandfathers are. And like when they, immigrated here from wherever country and, how tough things were at the time and how they built their life in America and how they were able to start a family. And that's how we became who we are. So again, that's why I asked that question, but I really appreciate the answer. And Kyle, it's been an honor to have you on the show. And I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And since we met, actually, I already had it in my mind that I wanted to interview you. So thank you for the honor of your time tonight. And, I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dave. And we'll be back up in Pennsylvania before too long. And I hope to see you then.